My whole desire at the time was I just want to walk the way he's called us to walk. Like he's saved me and I just want to serve him.
Welcome to Walk Like a Hebrew. I'm your host, Jody Odell. This is episode 10, part 1 of a conversation with Alisha Stubbs of Provo, Utah. This podcast is entirely listener-supported, so if you like what you hear and you'd like to hear more, please consider making a donation by visiting sheholdsforth.com and clicking the donate button. That's SHEHOLDSFORTH.com. Welcome to Walk Like a Hebrew. I'm here with Alisha Stubbs of Utah. Hi, Alisha.
Hello, how are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you.
Good.
Where do you live in Utah?
We live in Provo, Utah.
Provo. I just was reading something about Orem, and so that was what wanted to come out of my mouth, and I knew that wasn't right.
The reality is if you live in Provo or you live in Orem, you don't know because it's all the same city. I mean, literally from just south of us all the way up to Ogden, Utah, which is a good hour and a half, there's nothing but straight city.
My grandparents and great-grandparents lived in Ogden. That's where my family is from, is Ogden.
Yeah.
So I remember a little bit about that city from when I visited at age 10.
Yeah, I'm going to guess it's probably changed a lot since we were 10, right?
Yes, I would imagine so. That's been quite a while, hasn't it?
Yep. It's definitely changed a lot since I was 10, that's for sure.
Yeah. All right. So can you just tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I am a business owner and a wife, a mom, a grandma, obviously a Torah keeper. I've been a believer since I was 17. I will be 47 this year. So that's a long time.
Yeah.
Let's see. I have 5 children. 2 of them are biological. 3 of them are, stepchildren, although I don't call them my stepkids. I have 5 kids. Together, my husband and I have a beautiful family with 4 grandbabies as well. And we live here in Provo, Utah. I've lived here for 5 years. 5 years? 6 years. 6 years.
Sometimes it gets hard to count, doesn't it?
It does.
So the obvious question is, growing up in Utah, you're a Torah keeper now, but were you Mormon?
Yes, I was born into a LDS family. I was baptized into the church when I was 8 years old, but my family was never, they were not like what would be considered hardcore Mormon here. My dad was a Jack Mormon, which means somebody who believes the church is true, but practices nothing about it. Doesn't go to church, kind of thing. It's just a slang term that's used here.
Huh.
My mom's family was much more practicing. Yeah.
Okay.
So I grew up, that was the ideology. If I had questions about God that I was given, we went to church, Easter and Christmas and when my grandma would come into town. But I wasn't
so typical.
Yeah, but I wasn't, it wasn't something that it wasn't like we went to church every Sunday. Mm-hmm. Although like my grandparents were temple goers, like going and doing all the temple endowments regularly. So very practicing, but
okay.
Yeah.
Wow. And then tell me about how you became a believer when you were 17.
Yeah, when I was 17. I was born in Sandy. That's just a suburb of Salt Lake and lived here for the first part of my life. Growing up in Little Sandy, Utah, which, as you can imagine, is pretty much your whole world. Growing up that way, you don't understand that there's anything outside of Mormonism.
Right.
Somebody says God, you equate that to the Mormon belief structure because it's just your whole culture.
Yes.
But my best friend growing up had moved in from Texas and she was Lutheran and her parents would invite me to go to vacation Bible school in the summer and my parents would allow me to. Cool. And so as a little girl in the LDS church in Mormonism, I understood as a tiny young thing that there was actually something outside of Mormonism that believed in God and trusted in the Bible. So I always had that understanding, even though if you know anything about the Mormon culture, it is so it's hard to understand outside of that, especially, when you're talking, in the 70s.
Yes.
So, in early 80s. And so when I was 17, my now ex-husband actually, we got engaged and he decided that, if we were going to get married, this was the time to, quit being wild and crazy and get kind of on board with this God thing. And he was actually the son of a preacher. Okay. And his dad had passed away. I'd never met the man, but both of us were pretty wild and crazy. And apparently in his mindset, he needed to make sure that we kind of settled down. So we started going to a church that his sister went to. So I was 17. I was wild and crazy. The guy I was engaged to determined that, I needed to know about who this God was if he was going to marry me, and started bringing over a gentleman named Brad Scott to share the gospel with me.
That is amazing. Gosh, what
Yeah,
a small world.
so small, so small.
Ah, yes.
So then we started going to Bethel Chapel, which was at the time, I mean, we're talking
Mhm.
1990 probably. And our pastor at the time, Preston McNutt, they both were pastor and assistant pastor of a church called Bethel Chapel, a Pentecostal church, a Sunday going church, a standard Sunday going church. And that's where we started
Mhm.
going.
Wow. Okay. So, what was your depth of involvement in your Sunday keeping church? Like, were you in ministry? Were you a leader, or were you just a pew sitter? I mean, how important was being involved to you and your husband?
Well, when I was first born again, and we were, part of Bethel Chapel way back with Brad, nothing. We just went and participated, and we weren't leaders or anything. I mean, we were both just barely getting our stuff straight, So
Right.
neither one of us
Right.
belonged in any sort of leadership. We went
Yeah.
to Bible study every week with Brad, and Sunday church every week with Brad and Preston, and we were just digging into the Word at the time. But then we moved in, I guess I'd say 94. 94, we moved to Idaho. We were kind of lost as far as where to go. And Brad had suggested just going to a Calvary Chapel. And so going there, that's when we became really involved in the church. My ex-husband was part of the worship team, and we taught Bible studies at our home. Actually, we did a church Bible study, but we also did our own Bible study outside of the Calvary Chapel branch too. So,
Oh, interesting.
yeah.
And so you guys carried on doing that for however long. And then was there one thing that was a catalyst for moving you into this Messianic Hebraic lifestyle? Or did it happen gradually over time? Just tell me how that all came about.
So I think the biggest thing is like I mentioned, Brad was my very first Bible teacher. He was the very first introduction I had to the Bible. And so even though at the time, way back in, 1989 and 1990, Brad was still part of traditional Christianity, he still taught from a Hebraic perspective. The Bible studies we went to every week in his home were still from a Hebraic perspective.
Huh.
As a new born again believer, I never thought that the Old Testament and the New Testament were like they were opposing each other. That was not anything I ever understood because Brad never taught that, and he was the only person I got that from. Right? It wasn't until later on when we left Vernal and I left underneath this little like protective cloud that then I walked into traditional Christianity, which quite frankly, to be clear, there was nothing about Bethel Chapel. We didn't think we were separate from that. We were a Pentecostal church that, met on Sunday, and we loved Israel, and much of what we did, we spoke about, Israel and them being God's people. We always did Passover Seders. So although back then they were more the traditional, the way that, a Christian church will put on a Seder.
Right. Like Jews for Jesus style.
Yeah, like a Jews for Jesus style.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I'd always been aware of that. Brad and his family didn't celebrate Christmas. Those things were different than traditional Christianity. But I had no understanding how the Christian church was different than that because this is all I'd known. So leaving this little protective bubble of Vernal and going to Idaho Falls and going into a Calvary Chapel, that was really confusing just because I really, really, really loved the Word and I really, really loved studying it. And so I was somebody who was digging into the Word consistently for myself and already had the seed planted about what the Word was and covenants and all that kind of thing from Brad. So I'm reading the Word and I felt like I would go 2 steps forward in my own devotional time and 1 step backward every week at church. Personally, I did not understand that it was because the church was teaching me something separate from the Bible, which I think most believers don't.
Right.
I just thought it was just that I mean, they wouldn't, right?
No, they wouldn't.
I just really thought it was that he had been to seminary and I had not. And so I could see that there was these missing pieces that I didn't grasp what the Holy Spirit was telling me in my devotional time and how that seemed different than what he then was telling me in church sitting pew time.
Right.
And so I probably just misunderstand was really what I felt like. So, a few years later, my then husband and I moved to North Dakota. That removed us out of the church. The type of church that we were used to going to was very few and far between there. It's very Baptist, very Catholic, and very like Lutheran. So very different than if you're coming from a Pentecostal or even just charismatic, like a Calvary Chapel background. And so we would go to church and we'd pray about being there. And we really felt that Yahweh kept saying, no, not here, no, not here. And through that process, that gave us about a year of no input from the church. So we went from being very active and in a leadership role and also feeling somewhat confused, right? To now alone and having no input other than, I'm sitting and doing my Bible study. Now I have the Holy Spirit only guiding me and not the confusion of other messages. And that was really huge for us. About the same time we were moving, which would have been in like 97, that same time, we felt convicted that we'd started keeping Passover again on our own in Idaho, just because it was something that we'd learned from Brad and kind of felt like, we're going to go back to that.
Right.
And then probably the first or second year after we started doing these little seders on our own, we felt convicted to just do the feasts of God. We were like, those celebrations of God in the Bible, the other ones like Passover, like maybe we should do those too, just because they were what Jesus did. That was like our vernacular then. That was our heart. It was like, well, that's what he did. And so let's just do them, just kind of like something that we're going to do for a year. And we did. We only committed and planned on doing it for just a year. But that was probably one of the biggest like turning points for us. There was a bazillion things. Like for me, there was not one thing. There was a period of time, probably over 18 months, of beautiful things of Yahweh bringing in little, like what would seem completely inconsequential threads into my life. That together were like the very thing that was what he was trying to, bring me to. And so, number one, just always feeling like I was 2 steps forward, 1 step back in the church, but not understanding why. Obviously, just the fact that my first Bible teacher happened to be Brad Scott, who poured so much into me. And I'm looking at right now a bookshelf full of books he and Carol have given me over the years that are like probably $1,000 worth of research books. You know what I mean? Just like so to have somebody like that just as your mentor and being like so young and dumb and not even understanding how rich of a heritage that is to have somebody pouring into you like that.
What a blessing.
And so things like that, beautiful, beautiful things like that. But for me, my desire at that same time, if you remember at that time in the 90s, there was the whole "What would Jesus do?" phenomena.
What would Jesus do?
Yep. That was huge to me because my whole desire at the time was I just want to walk the way he's called us to walk. Like he's saved me and I just want to serve him. And that was my heart's desire from, a brand new baby believer. So as this whole "What would Jesus do?" thing came about, my heart just latched on that. I wanted to just know what it meant to be holy. I wanted to just know what it meant to walk the way he asked me to walk. When I would ask those questions in church, the answers were so nebulous.
Yes.
Yes.
I know. I remember asking my Bible teachers, my Sunday school teachers, even as recently as my late 30s and early 40s,
right?
Which commandments are we supposed to follow? Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Which commandments? Because the only list of commandments I know of were done away with at the cross.
Right.
So what are we talking about here?
And that was my exact internal struggle, internal struggle. So at the time that we had started, just for the sake of something that Jesus did, so we felt like we were actually teaching our kids something that Jesus did, and like, oh, this will be so neat for them to see what it was, what the things that Jesus celebrated were. As we were doing that, my heart was so struggling with, the song Refiner's Fire. That was a song we sang over and over and over again at Calvary Chapel. I mean, probably twice a month, right? Yeah. Yep. Still to this day, it's one of my favorites. And it used to just bring me to tears to sing that song. And I think that was one of the moments of like, I have to have more than just being a Christian. In the sense that I understood that there was more required of me, not because of salvation, but because of the great gift I had. Right. And so in that song, Refiner's Fire, my heart's one desire is to be holy, set apart for you, Lord. I remember that day just bawling in worship, which that's not unusual, but it was as I was in this space and crying out to God and the realization that my whole being was crying out to be holy for him. And so as I'm wrestling with this of like, okay, so what does that look like? I'm crying out to you, and what does that look like? And the reality was I have no clue what it means to be holy. I have no clue what that looks like. And I'm wrestling with this thinking, it's not just being kind. It's not being shiny, happy people. I know a lot of people. There's a lot of people, especially in the area I live in, they're lost. They don't know Yeshua, and they are very shiny, and they are very happy, and they are very, servant. They're the culture I live in, in a Mormon culture is very servant oriented, very much so. And they're lost. So those things don't mean that you're actually being holy for God, because
Right.
doing those things that we label as Christ-like things, those can't just be the things that label you're doing the holy things. And so for me, it was very much the realization that my heart's desire to walk in a holy way before my King, who had done so much for me, was so strong, and I was clueless. Like, I had no clue what that was supposed to look like. And that was kind of the beginning. And then we moved. I mean, it all happened so quickly. Then we moved away from Idaho to North Dakota, and we had no church. And I still had this deep desire and was studying the word on my own. And I felt like I was now kind of getting my head pretty cleared. And we were starting to keep the feast just for the heck of it. And all these things are coming to, coalesce all together. And at the same time, I had this same question that you mentioned, which is, I want to walk like Jesus. What would Jesus do? Well, I don't know what he would do, because you keep telling me he wouldn't do the things that it seems like he would do.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
Yep. And so there was all that inner struggle. I actually have pulled out an old Bible study series that we had. I think it's probably 18 tapes, or probably 18 tapes, like, old tape Bible study series, like, to date myself, right? That you would order from the Christian radio station. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so I pulled out those, and I think it was Chuck Missler. I think it was a Chuck Missler study where he was going to go through basically lining up all the commandments in the Old Testament and all the commandments in the New Testament. And I felt like if I lined those up, then I could know, because the ones that remain are the ones I don't need to do, right? Like, and the ones that line up, those are the ones I should do, because those, that just made sense in my head. And so I was in the midst of that study. We started with Passover that first year. We were doing the feast all together. So we kept Passover. We actually kept unleavened bread, which up to that point we had not done. We just did the traditional feast for Jesus Seders up to that point. We kept unleavened bread and all of the feasts all the way through, and we hit the fall feast. And this is about the time that I start the Chuck Missler series. And as we finished up the fall feast, we were really left in this place. I mean, when we started keeping the feast, we had no desire to do anything beyond just this fun little year thing of the feast. We had no inkling that how it would open our eyes to the difference between the things of Yahweh and the things of the world that we were celebrating. I mean, we were clueless. It was just something that was biblical that we wanted to experience. That's all.
Right.
And as we, came to the end of that, we'd actually started a little Bible study group in our home again, because that just always happened to be the way things went with us. But I mean, it was us and like 6 other adults. I mean, little tiny Bible study group on, I don't know, probably Wednesday night. And we had no church, and we were feeling like, okay, the end of these feasts are happening. And both of us, my ex-husband and I, recognized, like, everything that we've gone through this year seems and feels so different than everything we're about to re-enter into. Right. Like, cause we're coming up on Thanksgiving and Christmas and you know what I mean? And,
Yeah.
and that whole getting into the holiday season, if you will,
The holiday spirit. Yeah.
right, just felt so different from what we had been in. And so we were just in this wrestling place. We were just really, I'm seeking out, what commands do I keep? I really want to walk like Jesus. I just want to be able to know what it means to be holy and walk the way that he would call me to walk. And I'm struggling and so frustrated because I don't know what that's supposed to look like. And so we reached out to Brad, and we hadn't talked to him for probably about 2 years. I mean, we spoke with him, but not like in deep detail, face to face, hugging, having, sitting down to dinner kind of Bible study thing, just in, very much passing, in probably 2 years. And we're like, hey, we're out here. We still haven't found a church. What would you suggest? And Brad said, well, I just started the tape ministry of Wildbranch. And he's like, I'm going to send you out some tapes. And then I will start recording the Bible study that we used to be part of all those years earlier. And I'll send it out to you, and then we can talk. And we had just got online, like just started to get online. And so it was like, and he had just got online for ministry purposes and stuff. And so it's like, we can, email back and forth, those kinds of things.
Right.
So he sent the tapes, and the first tape he sent was Church on the Rock, or On the Rocks.
That's a great one.
It is.
Oh my gosh.
Which answered so many questions of why we both felt so strange moving back into the holiday season, if you will.
Yes.
And then, how then shall we live? Which is, okay, so if this is who we are, like, it answered the question of, what am I supposed to actually be doing as a believer?
Right.
Yahweh had been doing so much in my heart and in our hearts up to that point, but that was definitely like here's how I'm going to answer all the questions that just have you perplexed, if that makes sense. Like, I'm going to give you some tools to be able to dig in the word in a way that you're going to really get some answers, instead of kind of like this lost little mining child over here not finding anything about what I'm supposed to be doing. So yeah.
Wow. That's wonderful. And by the way, those 2 tape series that you mentioned, they are still available online. Church on the Rock or On the Rocks is free at wildbranch.org. And then How Then Shall We Live is available for $20 for that series.
Yeah.
And those are so highly recommended. I remember the history of the Church on the Rock or On the Rocks, blew my hair back. I mean, it was so mind-blowing that it completely changed my perspective on a great many things. And a lot of things started to make sense again.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. First of all, I was blessed to be born again into a teaching practice that is very different than a lot of people.
Yes.
And I still had to go through this journey. That says a lot, right? I, at this point, I mean, I was born again if I was 17, 90 would be when I was born again. And this is 97. So, 97, actually it was 98 when he sent us the things, because we kind of started that path in 97, and 98 is when we got the tapes. So, I mean, that's a long journey. It is, especially considering I kind of had the fast route.
Yeah.
I had questions only probably because, I don't want to negate the Ruach HaKodesh, because obviously that's the true leader in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But it was kind of like I'd been shown the treasure and then moved away from the treasure, where a lot of people were like, I think there's a treasure here somewhere. So I don't know. I think that says a lot about us, and, just as believers, the patience that we need to have with each other. So,
thanks for listening to Walk Like a Hebrew. Come back next week for the second part of Alisha's story. Remember to visit sheholdsforth.com, where you can find more shareable links to the podcast episodes, a donation link, and more. Also, now you can follow Walk Like a Hebrew on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Walk Like a Hebrew. Many thanks to Jack Lane of Folsom, California for the music. May Yehovah bless you. We'll catch you next time.